Okay. Stand very close. Okay. Kuyanami udlukut kaigasi. Unika ako madlakik katayla igluriniumiksano. Tana pimariyongman. Thank you so much for coming. This is an important issue that we're having a press conference for. Housing is at a crisis point for Indigenous peoples. The number one concern I hear from families is that they do not have access to housing. Inuit are compelled to leave Nunavut due to decades of neglect. Families are living in homes that are falling apart, living outside in freezing conditions, and do not have access to safe and affordable housing. Many are couch surfing in already overcrowded housing situations. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis continue to be denied housing, and we are calling on the federal government to do better. I'd just like to share briefly some stories that I've heard from Nunavummiut, including from a man who is homeless. He lives in a tent, in a canvas tent, in the winter conditions. Outside his tent were wolf tracks showing that there's predators that are surrounding his home tent. He knew that he'd be living in that tent all winter when I had interviewed him. This was just a few months ago. People are living in homes that are in dire need of repair. Families are using tape and cardboard to repair cracks on floors and walls because repairs are not appropriately funded by the government. Overcrowding in homes has led to severe mental health issues and the spread of illnesses like TB in Nunavut. Kuyanami.
I'm honored to stand here with my colleague, Lori Idlout, the MP from Nunavut, as the MP for Churchill, Keewatin, Nukaski, and the Deputy Critic on Indigenous Services. I am here, along with my colleague, to make a clear call to the Liberal government. Enough of the symbolism, enough of the feigned commitments when it comes to Indigenous communities, enough of the hollow promises on housing. It is time to act. Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister for 8 years. He rose on a commitment to transforming the relationship with Indigenous peoples. And yet when you look at the reality on the ground, there is not one community, one First Nation that I represent, where people would say that their living conditions have improved in the last 8 years. If anything, I have heard time and time again that things are getting worse. And a big part of that is because of the housing crisis that could only be termed, and many use this term in the communities that I represent, as third world. We are talking about inadequate housing, mold-infested homes, homes that are being, in some cases, held together with a tarp or some paneling, homes that still don't have the kinds of running water and amenities that you would expect, homes that are in desperate need of repairs, homelessness that can also look different. Couch surfing, people, particularly many single people, pushed out of their homes, even their communities, leaving them in urban centers where there's even fewer resources and supports necessary. The reality is grossly unacceptable that in a country as wealthy as Canada, that First Nations, that Indigenous communities live in third world housing conditions. Today, we are also here to expose the rhetoric of the Liberals, and our order paper question did, a series of questions did just that. So we know that there is, according to what we found out, that there is a need for between 35,000 and 85,000 homes on Indigenous communities in the country. At this rate, we know that it could take up to 141 years to meet the current housing needs. Unacceptable. We do know that the AFN has estimated the cost of closing the housing gap at $40 billion. And yet last year's budget, the Liberals promised to invest $4.3 billion over 7 years. I would argue that there is not one person that lives on a First Nation in northern Manitoba, and I would venture elsewhere as well, that would think that that figure is anywhere near anywhere near what is needed to begin addressing the housing crisis. We also found out some very problematic information when it comes to the work around CMHC loans. We know that CMHC committed to loaning $534 million while only dispersing 25% of that, $133 million and 963,727. So again, only 25% of the loans that CMHC committed to making available to First Nations homeowners were made available. We know that in 2023, CMHC received $109.5 million, but only distributed $536,000. Again, these figures are staggering, and they point to absolute inaction on the part of the Liberal government. They're not even fulfilling their own commitments, as we've seen through the CMHC program, and all the while, the housing crisis is only becoming worse. In this year's budget, we are calling for a massive increase in funding for housing projects in Indigenous communities and a commitment to get that money into communities as soon as possible. We are not going to sit by while the Liberals continue to use the excuse of consultation to delay delivering homes in communities. You know, we're not going to sit by and see the housing crisis become more acute in the regions that we represent. And we're not going to sit by while people's human rights are disrespected in terms of housing, where people are falling further and further behind. What we are saying here today is it is high time for the Liberals to act. These order paper questions expose some very unsightly reality that I'm sure the Liberals wouldn't want to be talking about. And what we're saying is that what's urgently needed is action on the ground, homes on the ground, working with Indigenous communities to address the housing crisis now. Look forward to hearing any questions you might have.
Hello, it's Brett Forster here with CBC Indigenous. I was just talking to Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu upstairs. She calls your numbers a bit of an exaggeration, and she says that they are committed and doubling down on the promise that they're going to close the gap by 2030. How would you respond to those comments from the minister?
I could just say a quick line. I mean, these are order paper questions. I'm sure maybe the minister needs a refresher. This is based on information that her own government gave us. So pretty rich to call numbers that her own government gave us an exaggeration, but clearly the Liberals are having a numbers problem. When you have the AFN being very clear that the housing gap is $40 billion, and the Liberals last year only invested 4.3 over 7 years, something's not adding up in the Liberal universe. But I would welcome the minister and the minister's team to familiarize themselves with their own department's numbers.
And as a follow-up, what's the number you have in mind that you would like to see in the upcoming budget to really get the ball rolling on this? And would your party be willing to withhold support from the budget if that isn't in there?
So we have different numbers from different national Indigenous we have different numbers from different national Indigenous organizations. So, for example, the Assembly of First Nation has said that they need at least $40 billion for last year, and that they needed about 3,000 new homes. The Inuit Tapiri Kanatami in their 2023 pre-budget submission estimate an initial capital investment of $55.3 billion over 10 years. So it'll be dependent on who you ask. But what I do encourage more people to do, especially people like Minister Patty Hajdu, is to go to my riding. Go and visit the homes that I see. Go see the peoples who are living in overcrowded housing situations. Visit Akvet, who has families living, who have created shifts for who's going to sleep in which bedroom in that house because overcrowded is so dire. So I really hope that she does come to Nunavut, see the realities that I'm seeing. Kuyan nami.
Any other questions?
No questions in the room, and I see none online, so if you have anything else to say, you're welcome to, but other than that, we'll conclude the press conference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Kuyan nami.
Just a picture. Okay, stand here.
Can you take a picture, Sarah?
Do maybe from here. Robert, peux-tu prendre une photo? Je peux te donner peut-être mon appareil.
Recording stopped.
Ah, super. I'm not this tall.
One, two.
Sorry.
No,